The Economist.
Hello and welcome to The Intelligence from The Economist. I'm Rosie Bloor.
And I'm Jason Palmer. Every weekday, we provide a fresh perspective on the events shaping your world. Spiraling prices, currency shortages, and huge queues for basic goods have long been fixtures of life in Cuba. But now that things have got entirely out of hand, the country's leaders are looking for help and finding a bit of it from Russia and China.
And even in wartime, people need to switch off and relax. Our correspondent takes a trip to Ukraine's south coast to witness the surprising resurgence of beach culture in Odessa. But first,
in the intelligence world, it's often the spies who get all of the credit, all of the glory, the people stealing secrets abroad. But that's just one half of good intelligence.
Shashank Joshi is The Economist defense editor.
Someone has to make sense of all of the stuff you've collected, and that's where the job of intelligence analysis comes in. These are thousands and thousands of people across the world who are piecing through little snippets of intercepted communications. They're looking at satellite images of war zones. They're reading through reports sent in by human intelligence agencies like the CIA or MI6. And that analysis is every bit as important as intelligence collection. But that world, like a lot of the world's labour market, indeed like much of defence and national security, is being affected, deeply affected in some cases, by artificial intelligence.
Shashank, are you really telling me that even intelligence analysts aren't safe from our AI overlords?
Well, no one is, Rosie. Do you remember a few weeks ago I was on The Intelligence talking about AI in warfare, and I think I used a phrase called human-machine teaming, that is, humans using software to help them. And that's basically what we are also seeing in this kind of intelligence work. The example I recently learnt of was a fascinating program called Sentry. To begin the story of Sentry, you have to cast your mind back to 2019. Donald Trump has signed a deal to get America out of Afghanistan, so troops are leaving, bases are closing, and intelligence assets are being sent to other places. So spy planes and other collection assets are just not there. And yet violence is rising steadily. And so American intelligence officers are asking, how do we get a grip on this problem? And their solution is to put together a special team. In fact, it has a great nickname. They called it the Nerd Locker. It was put inside a special forces unit inside Kabul, and it was tasked with looking back at historical data on violence in Afghanistan, particularly over the American occupation, but going all the way back, in fact, to the Soviet invasion of the country. And that was designed to try to find patterns in political violence that could be used to develop a model that would help those analysts.
And what sort of patterns were they looking for? What kind of data did they think could be linked to attacks?
Well, political violence isn't random, right? It's linked to all kinds of things, even surprising things. I remember reading last year a fascinating paper that said, if you look at survey data from Iraq and Afghanistan and you ask young men about their willingness to support political violence against troops in those countries, when the temperatures increased from a temperate 16 Celsius to a really hot 38 plus, the predicted probability of support for violence rose by tens of percentage points. So that obviously has huge predictive value. And so what the Sentry team did was take that data on historical violence and then try to correlate it to other kinds of data by feeding in everything from social media images, contemporaneous news reports, but also commercial satellite data. That was especially important. And here's the interesting thing. All of this was completely unclassified, what we call open source intelligence or OSINT. And then they got these contractors in Silicon Valley to build a model to predict when an attack might happen against a district or provincial center in Afghanistan. These are often, some fairly sizable cities, and also roughly how many casualties they think might occur. And so you have all kinds of incredible patterns in the mix. What they found, I was told by one of the companies involved in this, was that satellites would show towns becoming darker just before an attack occurred, but the specific parts of the town that had been previously associated with enemy activity, they would become brighter.
And why would parts of the town get brighter or darker?
Well, you don't exactly know why a model is making particular correlations. You just know what the correlation is. But the sense was that the town may have had some knowledge of the impending attack, people going indoors, shutting themselves away, yet in areas where insurgents were preparing, you may have seen heightened activity, thus more light at night. And the really interesting example for me was the example of synthetic aperture radar satellites. We call these SAR satellites. And instead of using ambient light like an optical satellite would, the kind that you're probably used to seeing, these send out little radar pulses so they can see things at night. And they particularly pick up on metallic reflections. And so what that tends to mean, we think, is that they can pick up signs of heightened activity by vehicles, which may indicate preparations underway. Now, I have to say, Rosie, all of this is kind of a little bit of guesswork. The model doesn't say, here's why precisely I'm making this prediction. But I think it's a really interesting example of how these signatures are out there, and you can find them if you dig into the data hard enough and cleverly enough.
I mean, it seems like a tough ask to rely on data when you don't know why it would be showing you these things. But presumably human analysts wouldn't even know to look for these things, let alone be able to quantify them.
Well, I think the answer is yes and no. This model was an example of supervised learning. So you kind of had to hold the model's hand. You had to say, here are the areas typically associated with violence. Look here, look there, focus on this, pay particular attention to crowds, look at the times that mosques are closing. So you kind of have to guide it. But then some of the patterns that emerge from this, I think, are probably quite counterintuitive, in fact, quite mysterious. One of the companies told me that satellites capable of detecting levels of carbon dioxide emissions would see heightened levels ahead of attacks. And it wasn't entirely clear why, but it did turn out to be a predictor of attacks.
And what kind of attacks has Raven Sentry predicted?
There's one example given in a paper on the subject, and that's an attack in the summer of 2020. The AI predicts an attack in Jalalabad, which is a city in the east of Afghanistan, Nangarhar province, and it said it'll probably happen in July. It will probably cause between 20 to 40 casualties, and the attack actually came on August 2nd, so a bit later on, and it killed an estimated 29 people. It was by Islamic State. What some of the users of Raven Sentry say is that international forces in Afghanistan were able to change their routes to avoid Taliban attacks, and that resulted in a lot of lives saved. And overall, by October 2020, Raven Sentry had achieved 70% accuracy, which means when it predicted a high probability of attack somewhere, an attack would subsequently come 70% of the time. And when I asked Colonel Thomas Spar, who's one of the intelligence officials who oversaw this, how does that compare to your human team of analysts? He said, to be honest, that's a pretty similar level. The model just does it much, much faster than the humans could. And what I understand is that over time, the model was getting better until it was shut down.
And why would you shut down the Nerd Locker? What was going wrong with the human-machine team?
Nothing was going wrong. In fact, it looks to me from the evidence I have that it was a pretty impressive success story and how to use AI to augment humans. It shut down because America pulled out of Afghanistan. And here's the thing, this was not a finished product. Many people in the Pentagon, many people in the American intelligence community were quite skeptical of this. They didn't think this was necessarily a great use of resources. But the point, I think, is that the technology has come a long way. And in war, the enemy always gets a vote. Colonel Spar, the officer who wrote this paper on Raven Sentry, points out in his conclusion that just as Iraqi insurgents learned that you could bamboozle American aircraft optics by burning tires in the streets, or just as, Hamas has learned that you can get away from Israeli surveillance by going underground in tunnels. He points out that American adversaries are also going to learn at some stage how to trick AI systems and how to corrupt the data that goes into them. And in that sense, I think we're at the foothills of the AI revolution in security and defense.
Shashank, it's fascinating to talk to you as ever. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me.
It has been a cruel summer out there in the world. If you feel the need to shake it off, we have an August treat for you beyond your wildest dreams. Yes, we too have some Swifties among our number. The next 2 episodes of our business and finance podcast, Money Talks, recount how Taylor Swift took on the music industry and probe the money and marketing behind her fame. The first show goes out today, and you'll need to be a subscriber to listen. Right now, you can get a month's free trial to Economist Podcast Plus. You belong with us.
In the late 1950s, America first began embargoing exports to Cuba. Arms at first, then pretty much everything else. So the country turned to its communist comrades in the Soviet Union. Cuba struck a deal to sell the Soviets sugar and to buy oil and other goods. But when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, all that dried up.
Gorbachev, with more than enough economic problems of his own, has axed aid to Cuba's economy, leaving the country some $2 billion a year the poorer.
Then came what Cuba's leader Fidel Castro euphemistically called a special period in a time of peace, comparing the country's deprivations to wartime. Cubans thought things were as bad as they could get. Turns out they were too optimistic. Keen listeners know that the country has been in a slow-rolling economic crisis for years, but now things are getting out of control and the government is again talking about a war economy.
Cuba is in economic crisis today. When I was there in May, the price of a carton of eggs easily outstripped the monthly minimum wage.
Sarah Burke is our bureau chief for Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean.
It's a crazy situation economically. People say what they can't get hold of is worse than in the 1990s. There are frequent blackouts as well. Basically, there's just not enough of anything and not at affordable prices because inflation is rampant. If this continues, the country really looks to be facing economic and potentially even social collapse.
And it seems like every time we've ever talked about Cuba's economy on the show, it's been about a brewing or growing crisis. How have things got to the stage we're at now?
It's true, Jason, and it's one of those things that's just one thing after another. So it makes sense that it's worse now than it was when we last talked. I mean, Cuban officials still like to blame US sanctions for the island's plight, and they definitely don't help. After the opening under Obama, Trump tightened sanctions again, and Biden has left pretty much everything in place. But really, the last 10 years, it's been Venezuela's collapse, which cut subsidized fuel. And then there was the pandemic, which hit tourism and the island's foreign exchange income. But fundamentally, this is about the model of the economy that Cuba uses. You know, it's a centrally planned, government-led economy. There's very little space for the private sector, and that just doesn't work.
But what specifically about the system as laid out doesn't work?
So you have the government running everything, and it's outdated technology, and it's unproductive, and there's no innovation. And so unsurprisingly, almost everything is produced in insufficient quantity. I mean, even sugar, which Cuba used to be known for, they now don't produce enough to even cover the country's need. And they also can't buy what's needed from outside because the government lacks foreign currency to import things because, again, they don't have enough, partly because tourism's not going very well. Inflation is rampant, and all of this is speeding up 2 things. So one is that the government really just has less influence, less control over what's happening. We're seeing more protests, for example. There were big protests in 2021, and then there's been a series since then, and the government cracks down on them. There's the private sector that they've given a little bit of space to, but that's not doing a huge amount to change the fundamentals. And then the second trend is that really we're seeing Cuba try and move even closer to Russia and China out of necessity. So we've seen trips to Moscow and joint declarations and trying to hug these 2 countries close.
So, coming back to the intrinsic problems here, what has the government done to try to solve its own problems before going to Russia and China?
Cuba does a little bit of opening up and closing and opening up and closing and trying to balance everything while sticking with the same fundamental government-led model. In 2021, Cuba's government introduced a law that allowed SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises, and it curbed in what sectors and how many people they could employ, but it did at least open up the economy or the private side of the economy somewhat. But it's now started to pull back bit by bit on those. We're seeing a backlash, which Cubans say always happens after a while. On Monday this week, the Cuban government issued a new decree, which basically laid out very clearly certain sectors that aren't open to these SMEs. And those include transport, which really needs investment in Cuba, and also book publishing, among other things.
And so Cuba, not for the first time, is turning to its global friends, in this case, Russia and China. What does it want? What's the ask here?
Well, it's always close to them, but it's obviously getting closer. And the first thing it wants really is economic help. So there's lots of talk and agreements for things like Russian investment in sugar production in Cuba or joint pharmaceuticals. And it's also doing likewise, trying to strike deals with China. And Cuba's also trying to attract tourists from both of these countries because Europeans, Americans, Canadians are coming in fewer numbers than they did before the pandemic or when Obama opened things up. But the other more worrying aspect is that security ties are growing as part of this. So Russian naval ships arrived in Cuba in June, and that's not the first time, but it was the first time since the invasion of Ukraine. So the context matters here too. And then there are things like CSIS, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C., which has suggested that China is expanding 4 installations that it could use to spy on the US from Cuba.
Which must make other people in Washington pretty nervous.
Yeah, so I was in Washington in June asking officials and other people about this. And really, administration officials play these concerns down. They say Cuba-Russia relations in particular wax and wane. And they're more worried about Chinese influence in their own country or in Mexico, really, than in Cuba. At the end of the day, neither Russia or China can actually offer that much to Cuba. They like to get their money back, which Cuba isn't good at doing. They're frustrated by the ineptness of the Cuban regime and its unwillingness to open up and follow a Chinese model of political tightness, but economic more opening. And obviously Russia is tied up with Ukraine and spending on that.
So with the government that is beset by all these problems and little help seemingly in prospect from Russia and China, you said at the beginning that there was this potential prospect for social collapse. Is this all ultimately a danger to the regime, do you think?
One of the things that Cubans have long said is that the revolution and the idea of equality for everyone is a good thing. And that sort of held when the government was providing the basic basket of goods. But now they're not even providing these things. So it's very hard to see the government being toppled, for example. There is inequality and unrest, but there's no alternative. There's no opposition that has any legitimacy or organization, and people know that. So really what they're doing is just leaving the country. So in the 2 years to the end of 2023, a humongous tenth of Cuba's population left the island. I mean, that's enormous, Jason. One thing that stops even more people leaving is the fact that Cuba's an island. One resident I talked to in Havana when I was there in May said if this country had land borders, there would be nobody left here.
I mean, given that assessment, even by someone who presumably, loves their home country, what hope do you see for Cuba?
At the moment, depressingly little. One former American official who long worked on all aspects of Latin America, including Cuba, told me, we're really working with a regime with no plan, no way forward, and no way out.
Thanks very much for joining us, Sarah.
Thanks, Jason.
As far as you can see, rows of deck chairs fill the horizon. There are kids swimming in the light currents. Tipsy, pot-bellied dads with bottles of beer, perhaps the 7th too many. And if you discount the sort of generator hum, it's nothing that visitors of Magaluf or Torremolinos wouldn't be used to. But this is Odessa.
Oliver Carroll is The Economist's Ukraine correspondent.
If you look just beyond the all-glass luxury resorts that line its waterfront, you'll see a port. A port which, in fact, can be the daily target of Russian ballistic missiles. And you glance up to your right and you'll see the Kovalov Palace, which was targeted in a cluster bomb attack just before the season started. Threats of ballistic missiles would normally be enough to put off holidaymakers. But here, the bodies are barely turning at the sound of the city's air raid sirens. The city and its beaches are still a tourist hotspot. Demand is huge. Trains, hotels, they're sold out weeks in advance. I'll just look now. I'm opening up the site for Ukrainian railways. On Saturday, no tickets. Sunday, no tickets. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 1 ticket. And Friday, they've put on an additional train just now. As far as hotels are concerned, some of the priciest rooms are going for $1,000 a night. I spoke to one of the hoteliers, quite a famous entrepreneur in Odessa, a man called Fazil Askerov. And he told me that essentially there are about 17,000 operating hotel rooms, but that takes in all the hotel rooms registered and not. And he says that essentially for the next month or so, they're 90% booked on a weekday and 100% at weekends. Actually, a funny thing is, some of the more creative real estate agents have actually taken to marketing their apartment rentals by saying they're on the non-drone facing side of town. So we're walking and we come across a man called Valentin Zakharchenko, a 74-year-old famous artist, in fact, who was just setting up his easel in a meticulous manner, trying to get the right light. And he's painting this image of a young man lying down, basically sunbathing in this paradisical view in front of him. And he tells me that in Odessa, he's not there for the sea, he's not there for the beach, he's not there for the city even, but he's inspired by the people and the atmosphere. And he tells me these seemingly relaxed people, they all know that war is still waging. They're all aware of the situation they find themselves in. What you see in front of you is a chimera. This has been an extremely scarring and painful 3 years. At the start of the war, of course, the ships were on Odessa's horizon. Russian troops were in Mykolaiv, nearby, 150 kilometers away. And there was a real sense that Odessa too might be encircled, that the ships on the horizon might eventually come to Odessa's shores, and its very future as a Ukrainian city was in the balance. There was a maritime blockade, and for a city whose entire lifeblood and economic raison d'etre was the port, this was a death without the death certificate. Now, the blockade was eventually lifted and life returned. The waters just alongside the beach have been specially demined for the season, but still the Ukrainian military is having occasionally to detonate the mines that come in too close. Last year, there were several explosions causing injuries and deaths, and as a spokesman for the Navy, Captain Dmitry Pletinshuk told me, basically, if you encounter a mine in the water, you're a goner. The probability is low, he told me, but it's real. Despite all of this, there is, it seemed to me, a demand for Ukrainians to return a little bit of normality to their lives. Some kind of holidays. You certainly couldn't deny them that. Walking past the Potemkin Steps, one of the major attractions of the city centre, we met groups of kids who had gathered there for an impromptu concert. And this, I suppose, is the life and the inspiration that Valentin, the artist, was talking about. The next day, he invited me to his studio, and it's completely brimming with hundreds of canvases. He lives a very simple life, It's from hand to mouth. He says he doesn't always have enough money to pay for the electricity. For him, the only thing that matters is art. But he's been thinking hard about the war and the way it's changed the people he paints. Everyone, he says, they're looking both ways. They're not sure where to go. And as he pulled out the painting we had seen the day before of the sunbather, he said he wasn't even sure how this painting would turn out. And he marked a line across the paradisical blue sky above the young male sunbather. And he said, see, it's the line, it could be a bird flying lyrically, beautifully over the horizon. Or it might be something quite different. It struck me that while he was looking down at the sunbathers, musing about the birds and the missiles, he was thinking hard about the city's own future.
That's all for this episode of The Intelligence. Let us know what you think of the show. You can get in touch at podcast@economist.com. We'll see you back here tomorrow.